Arizona Territory, 1884. Elias Cole, a war-worn ex-Buffalo soldier, tends his broken ranch in silence until he finds an Apache woman near death by his water trough. Her wrists bear the scars of government chains. No name, no crime, just a bounty that marks her as prey. That night, a rider watches from the ridge. Elias bolts the door. The war isn't over. Not for him, not for her. With nothing but a faded treaty and a silver medallion, Elias faces riders' lies and a law that forgets its own rules. But what if family isn't blood? What if it's the hand you choose to hold when the desert wants you buried, symbol the silver medallion? Will Elias fight for more than survival, or let the past ride them both down? The desert didn't speak much to Elias Cole anymore, not like it used to. Once it roared under cannon fire, under hoofbeats, under the screams of men charging through cactus and smoke. These days it whispered, and only when it had something worth saying. He was tightening the windmill bolts when he heard it, the faint scrape of boot leather on stone soft as a dying breath. He straightened, squinting toward the trough where his stock came to drink. The sun had just broken the ridge, spilling yellow across the hard pan. At first he thought it was a heap of rags blown loose from the fence, but then the heap moved. Elias dropped the wrench. He crossed the yard in 7 strides, his boots crunching over brittle ocotillo stems. She lay face down by the water, half covered in dust, her back rising in shallow, ragged intervals. Her skin was sunburned raw. Her dress, what remained of it, was torn near the hip, and one boot hung, half off a swollen ankle. Her hands were bound behind her, with dried rawhide edges stained with blood and grit. "Damn," Elias muttered. He pulled his hunting knife and slid the rawhide free with a single practiced cut. She didn't stir. Only her pulse told him she was alive, and barely. A thin line of dried blood clung to her ear, trailing down her neck like a forgotten sentence. He didn't ask who she was, not yet. Just scooped her up lighter than a feed sack and carried her across the cracked yard, past the dead rosebush he'd stopped watering 5 years ago. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of smoke and saddle soap. Elias laid her gently on the cot near the wood stove and fetched the kettle. He boiled water while washing his hands, then boiled more. He didn't trust the well much since the last flash flood, but it'd have to do. The sun was overhead before her eyes cracked open. They didn't speak. He set to work with mule hair thread boiled in water and soap flakes. His hands weren't steady like they had been in uniform, but the motions came back clean puncture-pull knot. When she flinched under the needle, he paused. "Name," he asked softly. Her jaw tightened. No answer. He stitched 3 cuts across her thigh and 2 more on her arm, then wrapped her ribs in a cotton undershirt torn into strips. She didn't speak, but she watched him, watched his hands, his eyes, his holster. That night, Elias sat at the kitchen table and watched her sleep. A lantern flickered near the stove. Outside, the wind rattled a shutter he hadn't bothered to fix since spring. He took her hands and examined her wrists under the lantern glow. Scars. Not fresh ones. Deep puckered ridges the color of dried apples shaped in ovals. Manacle scars. The kind made not by quick capture, but by weeks of wear. Weeks of being dragged or stored or tied like livestock. Elias had seen those marks before. Years ago on Yavapai men who'd walked from Camp Verde to Fort Apache in chains. Something thick rose in his chest. He sat back, jaw working. Then from outside the creak of leather, a saddle shift. Subtle, but not wind. Elias stood without a sound. He moved to the front window and lifted the corner of the curtain with a calloused finger. A rider, silhouetted on the ridge just below the moon's glare, motionless. Watching. Elias let the curtain fall, walked to the door, locked it, then barred it with a 2x4 and his father's old branding iron. Whatever storm this woman carried, it had just touched down. And for the first time in years, Elias Cole felt the desert speaking again, not in words, but in the low, tight hum of something unfinished, something coming. Tomorrow he'd need more water, and maybe more bullets. The woman didn't speak. Not the next morning, not that evening, not for 3 full days. She drank what he brought her and ate enough to keep upright, but her gaze stayed sharp like a cornered bobcat watching for the trap. The slip, the reach that meant pain. Elias didn't press. He wasn't the pressing kind. He boiled yucca root, let it cool, then mashed it into paste with a flat stone. She winced when he spread it across the swollen ridges on her wrists, but didn't pull away. That was something. Each day Elias kept the chores quiet, watering the horse, checking fence posts, repacking the root cellar with cool dirt. When he went outside, he left the door cracked, not for her to run, but to show he wasn't afraid if she did. The rider came back the second night. Elias had just finished scraping the last bit of rabbit fat into the lantern when he heard it, the hollow clop of hooves on shale, deliberate, unhurried. He moved to the window, careful not to tip the lantern's glow. Same horse, same silhouette, a limping roan with a left hind hitch. Whoever it was, they weren't scouting water. They were counting. Windows, doors, habit. Elias watched until the rider faded into the scrubland again. Then he slid the curtain back and turned the flame low. Inside, the woman sat up first, time she'd done that without help. "You seen him before?" Elias asked quietly. Her eyes flicked toward the window, then to him. She didn't answer, just shifted her legs off the cot like she wanted to stand, but her knees trembled too bad to try. "You don't have to speak," Elias said, tossing another log into the stove. "But if you got a name, it might help me figure out who's riding that ridge every night." Still nothing, just the low rasp of her breath as she curled back under the blanket. He poured her a tin cup of warm water, left it on the crate by her bedside, then took the shotgun from above the fireplace and leaned it by the front door. No use pretending the world wasn't knocking. On the fourth day it rained, just a hushed desert drizzle that turned dust to paste and drummed like fingertips on the tin roof. Elias was sorting old tack in the lean-to when he heard Asita scream from inside, not pain panic, ripped from someplace deep. He ran in fast. She was upright, fists clenched, eyes wild. Her chest heaved like she'd been running. No, get off!" She shouted words slurring from Yavapai to English and back again. Don't ride! Don't ride!" Elias grabbed the edge of the cot but didn't touch her. "Hey," he said, voice low. "Ain't nobody here but me." Her breathing slowed. Her shoulders sagged. Then in a hoarse whisper she said the first word to him that stuck ride. He nodded slowly, crouching a little. "Someone after you." She licked her lips, swallowed, then turned her left wrist toward the lantern. There it was, barely healed but clear now that the swelling had gone down. A branded letter M burned rough into the flesh near her bone. Elias inhaled sharply. He'd seen that mark before, twice, once in Elgin, once near the Gila. Men who wore it weren't prisoners. They were property claimed by Captain Merritt's private outfit. Government contracts gone sour. A loophole in the law where bounty turned into ownership. "You ran," Elias said. She nodded, weak but sure. He looked toward the locked door. "You know he's got men riding for you." Another nod. "You know what they'll do if they catch you." No response this time. She didn't have to answer. Elias stood, walked over to the old army footlocker he hadn't touched in years, opened it. Inside, a Spencer repeating rifle lay beside a rusted medal and a folded cavalry jacket still stained at the cuffs. He took the rifle, loaded a fresh clip, and set it by the table. "You ain't riding anywhere tonight," he said. "They want you back. They'll have to go through me first." For the first time, her eyes didn't just watch him, they held him. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Outside, the wind kicked up again, and somewhere in the dark, a saddle creaked. Elias sat on the porch with a cup of bitter chicory, the morning sun not yet strong enough to burn off the haze hanging low in the mesquite. Inside, the woman was awake fully this time. She'd stood on her own and taken a few steps. That meant the bleeding had stopped, meant she'd made a choice. She appeared in the doorway, blanket draped over her shoulders like a cloak. Her eyes met his. "I'm Naira," she said. Elias nodded once like she'd confirmed something he already knew. Elias. They didn't shake hands. Didn't need to. She sat beside him on the steps, back stiff. Her voice was quiet but steady. "They killed half my people near Oak Draw." Elias turned his head. "Who Merritt's men? Said we'd broken travel bounds. But the permit was good. The Indian agent signed it. We were moving toward Tucson trying to trade." He studied her face, the tightness behind her jaw. "They shot the elders first. Claimed they resisted. Took the rest, women, children, me. I got loose outside Pima Station. Wasn't supposed to make it this far. Why'd they chase you so hard?" Naira pulled something from beneath her blanket, a folded blood-stained paper, the kind printed on cheap ink and official seals. Elias opened it. "Reward, $100 alive." Naira witness to federal violations. Return to Capt. Merritt Dry Arrow Outpost. No questions asked. U.S. Contracted Authority. He read it twice, lips pressing into a grim line. No questions asked, he muttered. They always say that when they got something to hide. Naira tucked her hands beneath her legs, as if trying to make herself smaller. I saw them bury the bodies in a wash. Took their silver-even children's teeth. One boy still breathing, they laughed. Said that made it count as rescue. Elias stood. Walked to the corner of the porch, where a tin lockbox rested beneath a tarp. He hadn't opened it in years, not since the Army folded his last assignment and sent him back to dust and regret. He pulled out a cracked leather folder and brought it to the table. Inside was the 1873 Camp Verde Treaty, copied in full, a gift from a sergeant who thought words might one day matter more than bullets. Elias flipped to Article 4. Any Yavapai found beyond assigned reservation limits must be returned to federal custody under the oversight of an Indian agent without civilian interference or private bounty contracts. He tapped the line. This bounty's a lie, he said. Federal law trumps any paper Merritt's waving around. Naira stared at the treaty, like it was a map written in a language no one bothered to remember. He paid someone to write that bounty, Elias continued. Bet it's not even on record with the Territorial Marshal's office. Just enough signatures and a reward to make folks squint and look away. Her voice dropped. Then what now? Elias exhaled slowly. We take the treaty and ride into Dry Arrow. Find Marshal Hicks. Get it seen. You think he'll listen? No, Elias said. But he'll have to respond if we bring it to him proper. Make noise. Make it public. Naira hesitated, eyes drifting to the horizon. They won't let it go quiet, Elias. Pike's the kind who drinks from a tin cup and rides with 3 rifles on his saddle. I know the type, he said, jaw tightening. I served beside worse. She looked back at the treaty. Then we stand. Elias folded the document, gently tucking it back inside its folder. The sun had burned through the clouds, now casting sharp shadows across the yard. The wind picked up, tossing grit across the porch boards. He glanced once at her, thin, pale from blood loss, but sitting tall. We don't run, he said. Naira's lips twitched halfway to a smile, or maybe just relief in disguise. No, she said. We ride. And somewhere behind them in the cottonwood trees, a single crow called out, like it had just heard a promise worth remembering. The sun clung low on the horizon when Elias pulled his saddle tight. His horse shifted, sensing the tension in his grip. Behind him, Naira wrapped herself in his old duster, the collar pulled high to cover her face. Her cheeks still held that hollowed look, but her legs stood steady now. She'd insisted on going. You sure? Elias asked without looking back. I'm not hiding in shadows, she said, quiet but certain. Not today. Dry Arrow's adobe chapel sat canted at the edge of town, more ruin than church now. But twice a year, the circuit preacher stopped to hold his desert service, half sermon, half social excuse for ranchers and outliers to buy flower swap gossip and pretend the land wasn't trying to kill them all. Elias figured it was the only time he could ride into town without drawing too much notice. He needed salt new twine, a spool of thread, and maybe a pulse on Merritt's next move. They rode in slow. Naira stayed tucked close behind him, head down, arms folded beneath the coat like she was bracing for a storm. Children darted between crates. A woman strummed an out-of-tune banjo on the church steps. Smoke from a mesquite grill curled skyward, sweet and heavy, with roasted ears of corn. Elias dismounted near the general store. The town still hadn't forgiven him for leaving the army, but no one dared say it out loud. His name still carried weight, even if it wasn't welcome. Inside the store, the air was thick with sweat and kerosene. He kept Naira just outside the back door, behind a stacked bale of oats. 3 minutes, he said, pressing a coin into her palm. If something feels wrong, run. She nodded once. Elias made quick work of the list, speaking few words to the clerk. A mole-eyed boy too nervous to meet his gaze. As Elias counted coins, the bell above the door jingled. Evenin' Pike, someone muttered. Elias's hand froze mid-coin. Through the dusty front window, he caught the edge of a gray coat and the gleam of a spurred boot. Pike Merritt second. Mean streak wider than the riverbed, always carried 2 pistols and a silver tooth that flashed when he lied. You seen a girl, Pike drawled. Brown-eyed, younger, might be wearing blood that ain't hers. The clerk stammered. Can't say I don't lie. She's a runaway. Dangerous. Company wants her returned alive. Pays better that way. Elias took the bag of salt and moved without looking back, easing out the back door. Naira was already gone from the oats. His heart kicked once in panic. Then he saw her across the alley, pressed against the wall behind the smokehouse. She hadn't run, just repositioned. Smart. He gave her a small nod. They moved through the alley like shadows remounting without noise. Pike's voice still echoed faintly inside the store, asking about scars and blankets. They didn't speak again until they were 3 miles past the North Ridge. Then Naira handed him something, a torn scrap of newspaper folded like a note, ink smudged, written in pencil by a child's hand. They strike after moonrise. 7 riders. They said so loud. I heard. Tommy. Elias turned it over. Nothing on the back, just a smudge of dirt. Where'd you get this? A boy. Freckled, red hair. Gave it to me while you were inside. Elias exhaled slow. That'd be Tommy Harlow, widow's kid. She trust you? She owes me. I pulled her boy through smallpox when the preacher wouldn't touch him. They rode faster after that. Past the dry arroyo, past the fence line, with the busted post, until the roof of the cabin came into view. Elias swung down, mind already working. We've got hours, maybe less. He knelt by the porch and opened a weathered crate. Inside, horseshoe nails, a coil of tripwire, and iron caltrops the size of his palm. Naira crouched beside him. You said we ride to the marshal. We will, Elias said. But first we give Merritt's boys something to think about. She touched the silver M burned into her wrist, eyes hard. Let's make sure they remember it. Dusk stretched long and lazy over the desert wash, turning the sky a bruised purple, fading into star-speckled black. Elias worked fast, hands steady, despite the growing weight in his chest. He nailed wooden planks across the windows, sealing them tight against the coming night and its dangers. The air smelled sharp dust smoke and the faint copper tang of blood. Beside him, Naira knelt low in the dirt, her fingers trembling slightly as she buried Spike's caltrops Elias had sharpened the day before, beneath loose gravel along the south wash. The only path Merritt's riders could take without crossing open land. Each spike was a small guardian, cruel but necessary. Bells next, Elias said quietly, pulling out lengths of thin wire from the crate. Tripwire. When they cross, the bells ring. Naira's jaw clenched. I don't like traps, neither do I. But they don't come for conversation, Elias said, meeting her gaze. This land's been soaked in blood because of men who think justice is just another mark to claim. She nodded, brushing back a strand of dark hair. The silence between them was thick with something neither spoke, a shared weight born from old wounds. When the sun dipped fully, Elias handed Naira his spare Colt. Here, he said, voice low but firm. You'll need it. Her fingers closed around the worn grip, hesitation flickering in her eyes. Breath steady, Elias coached, crouching beside her. In. Hold. Then slow squeeze. Don't waste a single shot. She swallowed, then nodded. They waited in the darkened cabin, the only light a flickering candle shielded from the windows. Outside, the desert held its breath. Then came the slow, certain sound of horses. 7 sets of hoofbeats echoing against rock and sand, steady as a heartbeat, approaching from the south wash. Elias moved to the window, watching the lantern's hooded, careful cutting through the darkness like faint stars. The tripwire bells rang out sharp and clear, clinking a warning into the night. Chaos broke loose. 2 horses thundered onto the Spike's hooves, snapping against iron teeth. One rider cursed, spurring his mount sideways. Gunfire cracked like thunderclaps, but Elias only aimed for saddles, for rifle stocks, for the edges of pride. A bullet grazed Pike's shoulder, his men's leader and Merritt's right hand. Pike spat blood, swore, and called for retreat. The riders melted back into the darkness, swearing they'd bring the marshal next time. Inside, Naira's palm found Elias's scorched sleeve, a silent promise. Elias stared down at her eyes, flickering with something like hope, fragile but real. Not running, she whispered. Not now, not ever. Outside, the wind carried the faintest echo of hoofbeats fading into the night. For the first time since she'd stumbled to his trough, Naira let her guard drop just a little. But both knew this was only the beginning. The war hadn't ended. It had just changed shapes. And in the silence that followed, the desert seemed to whisper again, this time of waiting and of reckoning yet to come. The morning sun caught the glint of a badge before it touched the ridgeline. Marshal Levi Hicks rode into Elias's yard with the deliberate calm of a man who'd seen more trouble than the desert could ever hold. His silver star flashed against the dusty blue of his uniform. His boots pressed firmly in the stirrups, eyes sharp and unreadable beneath a battered Stetson. Elias met him at the gate, Naira, standing behind her, dark eyes steady despite the tension thick in the air. "Merritt's got you," Levi said flatly, producing a folded sheet of paper. The edges were creased, the ink faded but official-looking. "Looks like," Elias replied, eyes narrowing. "What's the charge? Harboring a fugitive?" Levi said, voice clipped. "Federal writ, signed by Merritt himself. Says you're aiding an outlaw." Elias's jaw tightened. "You read it?" Marshal Hicks unfolded the paper, scanning the lines carefully. Every word. "But something feels off." "Because it is," Elias said, stepping forward. "This bounty's a sham. Merritt's own paperwork's forged. Signed seals fake county clerks. You don't have to believe me, but my friend Dr. Harlow has something you might want to see." Naira shifted behind him, clutching her blanket like armor. At the doctor's small clinic on the edge of Dry Arrow, Elias and Levi waited while Widow Harlow pulled a yellowed copy of the Camp Verde Treaty from an old ledger. She cleared her throat, her hands shaking slightly as she laid the fragile pages out. "This treaty from 1873, she explained, was signed by federal and tribal leaders. It states clearly that any Yavapai found off-reservation must be delivered to the Indian agent, not private men with guns and contracts." Levi's gaze hardened as he scanned the text. "But," here she continued, "is Merritt's warrant. Notice the seal. It's not the Indian agent's, it's a forgery, and the county clerk's stamp doesn't match any official record in this jurisdiction." The marshal looked from the treaty to the forged writ, then at Elias. "You're telling me Merritt's been hunting this woman with false authority?" Levi's voice was low, but carried a weight few dared challenge. "Exactly." Levi's shoulders slumped, exhaustion flickering in his eyes. "I'll be honest. Merritt's got powerful friends, local lawmen, ranchers who turn a blind eye. He's been running his own show for years. And now he's gone too far," Elias said grimly. The marshal pocketed the forged writ and reached for the handcuffs hanging at his side. But instead of clasping them on Elias, he shook his head. "You're free to go," Levi said quietly. "But Merritt and his men, Pike especially, they're under federal investigation now. I'm taking this straight to Prescott. We're bringing them in for kidnapping, fraud, and murder." The words hung heavy between them. Naira's breath caught eyes wide. Relief flickered, but so did fear because she knew this fight wasn't over. Not yet. Outside, the dusty street was silent except for the distant creak of wagons and the occasional bark of a dog. Levi turned to Elias. "Why'd you do it? Help her, when it could have meant trouble." Elias glanced at Naira, then back at the marshal. "Because no one else would. Because family ain't always blood. Sometimes it's the hand you choose to hold when the world wants to bury you." Levi nodded, a slow smile breaking through the tired lines of his face. "Then let's make sure this family gets a fair shake." As Merritt and Pike were led off in shackles, under the watchful eyes of the sheriff and deputies, Elias watched Naira step forward, her shoulders a little straighter than before. The silver brand on her wrist still burned a mark of a past she couldn't erase, but now it was a brand of survival, of justice coming to light. And somewhere in the back of Elias's mind, the desert wind whispered that this was only the beginning. The fight for truth, for dignity, for family was far from over. But for now, they had won a battle. And that made all the difference. The morning sun poured over the ranch like a slow river of light, warming the cracked earth and casting long shadows over the weathered wood of Elias's porch. Naira sat on the step, her fingers tracing the rough grain still weighed by the burden of the past, but steadied by the small victories they had won. Elias stood brushing dust from his coat, his eyes distant but resolute. The previous day's success with Marshal Hicks had given them hope, but they both knew the real fight was far from over. "We've got to make sure the truth sticks," Elias said, his voice low but steady. "Merritt and Pike won't go quietly," Naira nodded, revealing a small bundle wrapped in buffalo hide. Elias's breath caught as she carefully unwrapped it, revealing a silver medallion, a crest he recognized immediately. The symbol of her clan recorded in Fort Whipple's ledger as the mark of the late Chief Nawa. "This was my grandfather's," she said softly, "passed to me when he died." Elias ran his fingers over the cool metal, feeling the weight of history and honor it carried. "Proof like this," he said, "that your story isn't just words." Together they packed a small bag, treaty copies, the silver medallion, and affidavits. 3 sworn statements from former Buffalo soldiers who had witnessed Merritt's crimes, lies, theft, and bloodshed hidden beneath the dust of broken promises. Elias strapped the leather to his saddle, checking his rifle, and loading cartridges with careful precision. Naira stood beside him, the fire of determination burning in her dark eyes. They rode into town with the slow certainty of men and women who had nothing left to lose but the weight of injustice. At the marshal's office, the dusty room buzzed with tension. Levi Hicks met them at the door, his face a mask of cautious respect. "You brought everything," he said, nodding toward the evidence spread across his desk. "The treaty, the medallion, the affidavits." "We need to make sure Merritt and Pike answer for this," Elias said, voice firm but measured. Levi's fingers traced the signatures on the affidavits, the clear print of the federal seal, the well-documented ledger entries. "Looks like the law's got no excuse this time," he muttered. But Elias could see the wariness beneath the marshal's eyes. "This won't be easy," Levi said. "They've got allies, men, who'd rather see truth buried than justice served." The courtroom filled quickly when the trial date was set. The townsfolk of Dry Arrow packed the benches, murmurs rippling through the crowd, like dust in the wind. Some eyes were cold, others wary. Merritt and Pike sat defiantly at the front, their bluster thin beneath the weight of evidence. The judge, a grizzled man named Harper, listened intently as Elias and Levi laid out the case. The silver medallion, the forged documents, the affidavits, each piece chipped away at the lies spun to protect a criminal enterprise. When Naira stood to testify, the room fell silent. She spoke with quiet strength, recounting the pain and loss endured, the betrayal of law twisted into a weapon. Her voice trembled only once when she spoke of the children buried without names. Elias reached for her hand beneath the table, steadying her with a silent promise. By the day's end, the judge's gavel fell hard. Captain Merritt and Mr. Pike are hereby charged with kidnapping, fraud, and murder under revised Statute 5346. A collective breath swept through the room. The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Brooks, stepped forward. Relief softened his features as he motioned for deputies to escort Merritt and Pike from the courtroom, bound not just by chains, but by the weight of their crimes. Outside, Elias and Naira watched as the wagon carrying the disgraced men rumbled down the main street, the dust settling on a chapter of reckoning. The fight had been long, the cost high, but for the first time in years, justice felt within reach. Naira turned to Elias, her eyes reflecting a quiet hope. "Thank you," she whispered. He shook his head, voice gruff but sincere. "No, thank you for trusting me." The desert sun dipped low, painting the sky with strokes of fire and gold. And as the shadows lengthened, two unlikely allies stood together, ready to build something stronger than fear, forged in the hard soil of survival and the promise of a new beginning. Tomorrow the work would continue. But tonight they had won, and that was everything. The weeks passed slower than the desert sun, hanging heavy over the canyon walls and stretching shadows like whispered secrets. The Yavapai elders arrived in quiet procession, faces lined with sorrow and resilience, their horses carrying the weight of history and loss. They came to claim their dead, the bones left behind in shallow graves and hidden washes. Elias watched from the porch, his gaze steady but heart heavy. Naira stood beside him, the silver medallion resting against her chest, catching the light like a fragile promise. The elders spoke in low tones, voices threaded with tradition and grief. They thanked Elias for his protection, for standing with Naira when the world had turned its back. Then, with solemn hands, they offered her a place among their people once more, a home among the red rock cliffs and sagebrush winds. Naira's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she looked toward the gathering. It was a home she had lost, a family she had almost buried beneath the weight of betrayal and bloodshed. But then, as the sun dipped behind the canyons, she turned toward Elias. Slowly she reached for his hand, her fingers curling over the calluses and scars. "I carry more than my past," she whispered, voice trembling but clear. "There's new life here." She pressed his hand against her midriff, a small tentative bump beneath the worn fabric of her dress. Elias's breath caught. He looked down at her, with eyes wide, and heart suddenly hollow and full all at once. The chief of the elders, a tall man with silver braids and eyes like storm clouds, stepped forward. He studied the pair with quiet understanding. "Blood and promise belong where the heart stands," he said softly, voice carrying the weight of generations. "Your choice is yours, here or with us, but know this, family is not only born, it is made." With reverence, the elders presented gifts to Naira: ears of corn, chiltepin seeds burning with fiery red, and a cedar cradle board carved by the finest hands in the tribe. Each item carried meaning, life protection, and new beginnings. Naira accepted them, tears finally spilling free. She looked back at Elias, a silent question hanging in the air between them. "No preacher," Elias said gently, "no vows, just two palms pressed together." She smiled, a genuine radiant thing that cracked open the desert's long-held silence. Together they knelt before the elders' palms, touching an unspoken promise woven with hope and strength. That night, the stars blinked down on a land both harsh and sacred. Somewhere between the red rock and whispering wind, two hearts chose a path forward, not defined by past scars, but by shared futures. Elias helped Naira cradle the small bundle wrapped in blankets, a promise of new life, fragile but fierce. They sat near the fire, the warmth weaving between them, a quiet comfort against the vast silence of the desert night. Outside, the canyon whispered its ancient songs of survival, of resilience, of families born from ashes and dust. And in that moment, beneath a sky vast and endless, hope found its foothold. Tomorrow would bring its own trials, but tonight they had each other. And sometimes that was enough to change the world. Summer rolled in with the monsoon's first sigh softening the hard-pan earth and bringing a brief precious green to the dusty washes. Elias stood outside the cabin watching as Naira knelt within the stone windbreaks, planting corn and lavender seeds carefully between the rocks. Her hands moved with a gentle rhythm, coaxing life where the world had once promised none. The baby's cry echoed faintly from inside the small bundle. Elias rocked in his arms, swaddled and warm against the desert chill. Ahyoka, they'd named her, she who brings happiness. Naira had whispered, tears glistening in the firelight. The silver medallion hung from a leather thong above the cradle, catching the fading sun like a beacon. Elias looked toward the horizon where the red cliffs stood silent, ancient guardians of a land both harsh and forgiving. Behind him, the cabin's walls bore the marks of the past, the scars of struggle and survival, now softened by time and care. Some townsfolk still averted their eyes when they passed the ranch, whispering in shaded doorways or casting sideways glances from behind curtains. But none questioned the law now, nor the marshal's iron will that kept Merritt's shadow from falling here again. The Sheriff Brooks had paid a visit that morning, tipping his hat with a nod that held grudging respect. "You've done good," he said quietly, voice rough like gravel. "This place, it's yours again." Elias didn't answer. He only turned back to the porch where Naira's smile caught the breeze and held it gently. That evening, as the sun bled orange into the west, Elias sat by the fire cradle in his lap. His fingers brushed over the worn silver medallion, tracing the etched lines that told stories older than the desert winds. Ahyoka stirred small fists, reaching for the stars painted on the ceiling. Elias hummed a slow, steady tune. Army taps softened into a lullaby, his voice rough but tender. The world outside was quiet now, the kind of quiet that stretched between moments filled with hope and the promise of morning. Naira joined him, settling beside the fire, with a basket of freshly picked lavender. She reached out her fingers, brushing his arm, in a touch that spoke more than words. "We grew something here," she said softly. "More than corn," Elias replied. "Something that wouldn't take root anywhere else." They sat together watching the fire's glow ripple over the stones. The land once cracked and unyielding was changing just like them. Corn tassels waved in the evening breeze, green flags of a family forged where the world had sworn none could grow. Elias looked at Naira, at their daughter, and felt a quiet strength settle deep in his bones. "We made it," he said, voice barely above the wind. "We did." She smiled. The desert night stretched wide above them, vast, endless, and full of stories yet to be told. And beneath that endless sky, a family sat together, grounded in the hard earth, and held by the soft light of new beginnings. The world might have once spat on them, tried to erase them like dust on the wind. But here in the garden of their making, they were more than survivors. They were home.